Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. I am delighted to have Joy Mayer in the studio today from Trusting News. Joy, welcome. So glad you're here, and I am excited to talk about how news can become better trusted and what journalists can do to help that.
Me too. Wouldn't that be great? Imagine a world. Yes.
So tell us a little bit about Trusting News. You started this organization a couple years ago. So tell us why you felt there was this need and why you were uniquely situated to do something about it.
Sure. It's been almost 10 years since I
Oh
founded
my
Trusting
gosh.
News. I was working in community news and teaching at the Missouri School of Journalism and realizing that journalists were facing a lack of faith in their integrity that felt new. Journalists have always been, criticized. There are always people in communities who are going to say, you messed something up or you're not covering this right. And that's absolutely understandable and intentional. That's fine. But what we were facing was, as we were trying to get the public more engaged in the news, we were facing basic questions about whether we were a force for good in our community. Like, are we telling the truth? Are we pushing an agenda that we're hiding? Are we really a public service? Like the basic things that mission-driven journalists take for granted could
And
no
that
longer
is
be taken for
such a
granted.
gut punch when you're a journalist, because journalists don't want to be part of the story. They also, in my experience, have really high standards of personal integrity and wanting to be transparent and show the truth. So, wow, that is really painful, I think,
Yeah,
to
and
recognize.
journalists were feeling what I noticed is that journalists were feeling really depressed about that and kind of defeated and demoralized. But their response was to just kind of dig in and say, I guess I'll just keep doing what I'm doing and hope that changes. And it wasn't changing, it was getting worse. So I just set out to figure out how trust is gained and lost, what that looks like in journalists, and what journalists could do about it. So it started as just a project that was just me working with some partner newsrooms to try to test out some trust building strategies. And we've kind of grown slowly ever since.
So when you're doing trust building strategies, I mean, it feels like you're drawing on different disciplines like psychology of trust and so forth. So how did you, do you find that you can kind of pick the ideas of trust up from other disciplines and plop them right down in journalism, or do they get nuanced in the journey?
I mean, they definitely get nuanced in the journey, but some basic elements of trust that researchers study across industries are at play here. Things like, credibility, integrity, benevolence. Do people trust that we as journalists care what happens as a result of their work? Do we want what's best for the communities we serve? These are things that I could ask about my cable company or my neighbors or my doctor, that also people are just asking about journalism. And this, I've been doing this for 10 years, the ecosystem has only gotten more complicated to navigate. So while it is a gut punch for journalists in the kinds of newsrooms I've been lucky enough to work in to think that people don't trust their integrity, at the same time, I see plenty of things happening in the information ecosystem that don't deserve automatic trust, that people are correct to be skeptical of. It is very confusing to tell what's true. It's confusing to know where to spend your trust. And so I think, the answer for me is not to just defend the media in general or even defend the news media. It's to help journalists say, here is why my colleagues and I are worthy of your trust. Your trust is precious. I respect it. I would like to earn it. And here's how I'm willing to earn it.
So then let's jump in, because it's evolved a little bit, not necessarily the message, but sort of the packages or the way you go about it. You have these fun little snippets, like nuggets, on your website called trust kits. And so
Mhm.
I wanted to better understand, and there's a lot of trust kits. And so I wanted you to talk more about, well, what's a trust kit? And then also how you choose those topics, because there's a lot of like interesting veins that you're mining there.
Yeah, we created the trust kits a few years ago as a place to collect our most foundational strategies, the things that newsrooms were asking for help with the most often. And some of them are very, very basic, and some of them are more specific to what we do at Trusting News and have kind of evolved over time. But they're things that we wish every newsroom would do. And so we
Okay.
wanted to create sort of a one stop shop for newsrooms saying, oh, I guess maybe I could make some improvements there. Where do I start? And it walks through steps to take and shows examples of how other newsrooms have done it. So some of them are super basic, like, do you know that many people don't assume that journalists correct their errors? And if
Mm,
somebody asks me, how do I decide if this news organization is reputable? One of my first questions is see if they've got a policy saying that if they get something wrong, they'll tell you that they messed up. It makes sense, right? Think interpersonally. Think how mad you are if somebody in your life messes up, like stands you up for something, right? Well, if they show up and say, gosh, I'm really sorry. Here's how that happened. I'll try not to do that again. Like
mhm.
that's repair. And so fundamentally, that's what a correction is. So we have a trust kit on corrections. You wouldn't believe how many news organizations still don't have a policy that says, here's the kind of error we'll correct. Here's how you can submit a report to tell us we got something wrong. Here's where those corrections will go. It's not universal. So we have a
Interesting.
really simple guide that
Mhm.
says, here's how you as a newsroom can make sure that your process around errors and corrections is transparent and invites your community to hold you accountable.
Mhm. And so it strikes me that, in some ways there's two different lanes here. You have the news organization as a whole and how that organization can build trust. And then you have individual journalists um, also building trust. And sometimes, not every news organization is acting um, in a trustful way all the time in every situation. And so there's certainly issues. So that's I have you noticed sort of over time, like you've now that you've been doing this 10 years, are you seeing more individual journalists wanting to stand up for themselves, or are you seeing more organizations saying, hey, this is an issue and some of our unspoken rules now need to be codified? Are you seeing kind of that dichotomy play out?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing both and we need both. Some
Mhm.
of our strategies happen at sort of the brand level. Like an individual reporter in a big newsroom can't be the one to say, "Hey, I'm going to disclose when I made an error and have a corrections policy about that," right? But an individual reporter can earn trust with sources differently.
Mhm.
Like respect that people are wary of talking to journalists and adopt practices that will encourage someone to talk to you, that will um, earn basically individual reporters could do a lot more to earn the right to tell somebody's story
Mhm.
and to work within an ecosystem where people are wary and skeptical of journalists. So that's a practice that you don't need your whole newsroom to buy in on that. We have a trust kit that's going to walk you through. Here's what you should explain about how the interview will work and what
Mhm.
your story is and what you will be careful to do. Ask reporters, ask sources, what are you afraid I might get wrong? Like try to even out the power dynamic between reporter and source. So we have a whole trust kit about interactions between an individual reporter and a source that you don't need the boss to sign off on to do that.
Well, and I we've done some sessions here on the podcast about building sort of working in maybe traumatized communities or with
Yeah.
traumatized sources, and a lot of what you're recommending to build trust, are all the toolkit resources that you need to deal with a source or handle a source that well, and everyone in some ways, news media goes on people's worst day ever and then asks them probing questions about it.
Yep.
So
And
being
sometimes behaves as if they have every right to be there. And people
right.
should are like, we behave like we're owed people's stories. And when you're interviewing the mayor, absolutely different set of strategies. But if you are coming to a regular person and saying, tell me what happened, there are a lot of
Right.
better ways we can go about that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also it's helpful just to recognize that people don't know journalists in their area. I think there's a Pew study that recently came out saying something abysmal, like 12% of Americans know a journalist.
It's
And so,
22.
oh,
22% of
22, thank you.
journalists have ever talked to a local journalist, which means 78% of people have no frame of reference. They're not giving us the benefit of the doubt. They don't know anybody. They haven't had positive interactions to fall back on, which means that most of the time when journalists are approaching somebody, you are the first journalist they've ever talked to. There's such an opportunity to invite people to get to know you, to like lay a groundwork for trust, to lay some foundation for why you're there and what you're doing that we too often hurry through and just don't have respect for.
Well, and in today's news environment, I mean, the news cycle is so demanding and so quick. I think many journalists fall into the trap of feeling like those interviews and that reporting is transactional, when really what would be a better way to approach it is to look from kind of a systems perspective and look at people as individuals, and that you're truly building a relationship. It may be a short-term relationship,
Hmm.
but it is a relationship
Hmm.
if you want to get the story that you're looking to get. Is
Yep.
so.
Absolutely. Transactional and also extractive. And
Mhm.
I get interviewed a lot, and I've had that. I call it having journalism done to you. I've had journalism done to me where someone's like demanding I comment on something, doesn't give me any information about the deadline really or the story, just says I need to talk to you, and then will like email again 6 hours later to say, why haven't you responded to me? Like just so abrupt. And I'm like, wait, what's the story you're doing? And why are you in a hurry? And what role do you hope I'll play in the story? And can you acknowledge, please, that I'm dropping what I'm doing
Mhm.
to share this, to share my perspective with you, and that um, I'm making myself vulnerable and trusting you to get it right? Sometimes they don't get it right. And
Right.
that's really frustrating. It doesn't
Mhm.
feel good.
And so I'm curious actually, when you were a reporter and sort of with this perspective you have now, how do you think, what would you do differently if you could go back to, I guess, less seasoned Joy? I don't want to say young Joy because you're still young and vibrant, but sort of your daily reporter Joy. What would you do differently knowing what you know now?
Mhm. I would spend a lot more time listening. I would spend a lot more time not relying on my own assumptions and perspectives and those of my colleagues to figure out what the community needed from me and what it looked like to be useful. Journalists are not the ones that get to decide if they are offering a real public service. It's the public that gets to decide if they are actually served. And too often, journalists make decisions very from kind of an insular perspective, surrounded by people who see the world like they do.
Hmm.
And then we wonder why people in the community are saying, gosh, that journalism was not made for or by people like me. They're not wrong. Journalism is made by people who are tend to be in cities, tend to be whiter than the community overall, obviously are more educated than the community overall, tend to be more liberal, tend to be more secular. There are all these things that journalists have in common with each other that are, and then we assume, like most people do, that we have a broader perspective than we actually do. So
Hmm.
my wish for journalists, and what I would love to go back and tell my younger self is there's a lot that you are missing by virtue of just being a human who can't see everything. And so, what practices can we adopt in newsrooms that will keep us, that will offer more continual feedback about how successfully we are serving our communities and
Hmm.
also keep us in better touch with people who see the world differently?
I love that you're like, this is a transformation project in many ways, under, not under the guise of truth, but under the sort of using trust as kind of the way in. And it does bring in, the trust brings in transparency, it brings in listening, could be all of those pieces are things that are very kind of hot in newsrooms right now, like listening
Mm.
circles and being reflective of the community and listening to what the community wants about coverage. In some ways, it feels like all those pieces are tying into what you're saying is the central issue, which is building trust. Am I
Mhm.
getting that right?
Yes. And I think you can only build trust if you understand mistrust. So the reason there's so much listening engagement involved is because you need to understand what people think of you and what people need from you in order to build stronger relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're absolutely right that I'm glad newsrooms are talking about these things so much. And it feels so foundational because people only pay for things they trust with their attention, with their time, with their donations, with their subscriptions. Like you are not going to support organizations that don't feel relevant to you, that don't feel useful to you, and that don't feel accurate or reflective of how you see the world.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like when someone wants to, like when you talked about learning more about trust, you really have to understand what mistrust is. And so I think for many journalists who are working so hard and have their hearts in the right place, organizations for the most part do as well, it can be tough to listen to those hard truths about
Mhm.
yourself. So, over and above sort of the proactive, here's what you can do to build trust. Do you have suggestions on what people can do or think about as they're maybe looking at their past to say, "Gosh, I haven't always been the organization or the person that I wanted to be," or how do you get through listening about yourself when that
Mhm.
story is not all like, "Oh, you did a great job on that story."
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. And you've hit on something that has become increasingly important to us at Trusting News, which is the humility that is
Mhm,
needed in order to properly invest in this work. Because you have to be willing to hear from people who say, um, here's something you've missed. Here's something I'm assuming about you. Here's something, here's where I feel neglected by your journalism or misrepresented by your journalism. You have to be able to hear that. And of course that's accurate. Of course we know fundamentally that we are not reflecting the lived experiences of everybody in our community. Of course we know that we serve some slices of our community more than others. Um, of course we realize that every single time we decide to talk to four people or seven people or two people and craft a story, there are other perspectives we are leaving out.
mhm,
So there's a lot of humility needed in order to sit down with somebody and say, how are we doing at covering your neighborhood? How are we doing at, do you see your own experiences reflected in our coverage of, education or small business or development or whatever
mhm,
it is? Are we serving you? Um, we have, when Trusting News started, we really launched with a solid foundation of transparency. Here's what we need to be explaining about how journalism works. And absolutely, that's still true. There's a
mhm,
lot we need to be explaining about how journalism works. But the flip, and then engagement, we need to be listening to people and being responsive to their questions about journalism and to their information needs. But increasingly, we've been talking about accepting how even if we are responsible, mission driven, ethical journalists, we get things wrong. We miss things. We are
mhm,
serving some people and not serving other people very well at all. And if we would like to be relevant to our whole communities, especially those of us who are trying to serve like a geographic area that has such a diverse set of experiences in it, we just need to be willing to really listen to and be curious and humble about who we're not serving.
yeah. I think it's hard sometimes to disengage your defensive reflex because for each of those, like, you weren't listening to me as a journalist, you can be like, but wait, I did this, I did this, I did this. And so it goes back to, I think, what you said earlier about listening. Like it is, and it takes a lot. In some ways, I feel like to listen without defensiveness, you have to kind of disengage a little bit and be like,
Mhm.
okay, this is not about me. I'm not part of the story here. I'm going to listen to what's happened, and then I don't have to react in the moment necessarily. I'm here to take this in
And
and
learn from it.
learn from it. And I think that can be very difficult to kind of just go one on one out in the world and be like, I'm going to do my own listening tour and hear this
Mhm.
and that, and then not quite know what to do about it. So,
Mhm.
does Trusting News kind of have strategies on setting up those types of circles? I know that there's other organizations that do that as well, but I'm just curious, and I
Yeah, one
apologize
of our
for not
trust
knowing.
kits. No, one of our trust kits is called "Listening to Reach New Audiences," and it has we've done a lot of projects where we send journalists out to talk to people in their community.
Mhm.
Sometimes they have identified a specific community they would like to have stronger relationships with, communities of color, people who lean right. And sometimes it's just go find people you're not serving very well, who are not your core audience, and ask them questions like, do you see your own life reflected in the news? What do you
Mhm.
wish journalists were paying more attention to? These are not complicated questions, but we actually have scholarly research that shows that when journalists conduct this, trust is built both ways. The journalists have more positive sentiment toward the people, and the people participating have more positive sentiment toward the journalist and the news brand. And people report being more likely to subscribe or donate after having
Mhm.
like one 30-minute conversation.
Oh,
So
wow.
that doesn't scale super well. Like we can't talk one on one, but the themes from those conversations can absolutely inform the story we tell about ourselves. If you're hearing from people that they want you to cover certain things or that they don't understand fundamental things about you, then you can get busy explaining them.
Mhm.
So, like one core example is we have a trust kit called Making Your Ethics Visible. And, it's so funny. Journalists are we assume that people understand that we have a solid ethical framework on which our work is based. But
Mhm.
all of us could point to examples of things done in the name of journalism that we would not stand behind from an ethical standpoint, right? And when it comes to things like we'll correct our errors, we give sources time to respond before, we're not here to do gotcha journalism. If we have an anonymous source, if we let a source go unnamed, there's a process by which we have decided that, and multiple people in the newsroom know who the source is. Like basic things about our practices and how we operate that the
Mhm.
public does not know because we don't talk about them. So we could incorporate a practice of saying, what decisions did I make in this story that
Mhm.
might help people consume it through a spirit of like respect for our process and understanding for our process?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, because I do feel like sometimes, you ask, well, why didn't you talk to this person, or why didn't you go here or take that angle? And so, yeah, explaining and being more transparent would make a lot of sense there.
Yep, we have a trust kit on sourcing, like explaining your sourcing specifically. There are just
Mhm.
things, and it's not in every story. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not that interesting. But the more you learn about why people don't trust you, the more you are able to identify potential for like, oh wait, I just made this decision. We just spent 10 minutes in the newsroom talking about which sources are the best ones for this story. This is a complicated story. People might be suspicious. Let's add a box in the story that says, here's why these sources were the right ones. Or
Mhm.
here's why we trusted these sources. Or let's just add an extra sentence in the story explaining something about the specific viewpoint or credibility of a source.
So when organizations or journalists are kind of navigating your website and saying, what do I do with, these 15 trust kits that are out there? Um, it sounds like you start first with laying out your process and sort of your ethics and the transparency. And then when you feel the pinch in your own reporting to say, gosh, I'm really stumbling over, how to source this, or I've done some of my listening tours, and these are the issues that are coming up. And then you just match it to the source, to the trust kit.
Yeah, the more visible you can make it day to day, the better. Because even if you have a really solid ethics policy on your website, which not all news organizations do,
So true.
even if you do, not that many people are going to go hunt for
Oh,
it
for
and
sure.
find it and
That's
read it. But
that's
so
not going to
it's
be the highest thread.
relevant.
Hmm.
Right. People care about your ethics when they are reading a story and wondering about your ethics, right? And so they're like, how do they really know that? Or, gosh, I hope this source was okay with that. Or, why did they even cover this story? We don't talk about how we decide what to cover?
Right.
So there's just so much that we take for granted that people know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, earlier you had talked about the scholarly research that underpins the sort of trust aspect, the trust psychology, and what you've done. Have you worked with researchers on your trust kits and the project in general? And what have you found?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with academic partners who are excited to test things out in newsrooms with
Hmm.
journalists. So we work with partner journalists who are willing to help us learn, and we work with researchers who are excited to test things out in the field. And so over and over, we find that when people are given a window into how and why journalism is done, they have more trust in it. Whether that's adding a box to a story, whether it's adding information on air in a TV or radio story, whether it's the engagement interactions. Over and over, people report having more positive feelings about and more trust for journalism when they understand more about how it's done.
So thinking about and that makes a lot of sense because you trust what you understand and you push away what you don't understand. The academic partners that you are using, what are some of the types of research questions that they're going to newsrooms with? What are they interested in these days?
Yeah, they are very interested. I've been having fascinating conversations recently with researchers who are interested in how journalists cover democracy and
Mm,
the things that journalists take for granted in the word choice that we select, and how journalism is journalism sort of codes differently for different people. Like when we use language, we're often, without even realizing it, adopting the language of one side of an issue,
sure.
or sharing things through a perspective that will feel perfectly normal to people who see the world in certain ways and will feel alien to people who see the world in other ways. So I'm
Mhm.
working with a set of researchers now on looking at what journalists could do to make the basic elements of democracy more visible. Like, let's talk more about due process. Let's talk more about the branches of government and accountability and checks and balances, as opposed to just saying, like, this is a threat to democracy and assuming that everybody knows what we mean.
Well, and I think you're so right because, high school civics courses have sort of dwindled, just like high school newspapers are almost non-existent. All those sort of first experiences that people have with getting to understand the process or asking critical questions or trying their hand at reporting at their school paper, all those opportunities have dwindled. And so where are people learning those things? And so if
Mhm.
they're just kind of with the attention over, or I guess the information overload and attention deficit in our culture, we all are using shorthand, but
Yeah.
maybe not quite understanding shorthand, what the shorthand is meaning.
Yep.
Um,
How it lands, how it's interpreted. I mean, that really speaks to a much bigger question, which is, how are people figuring out in the wide world of information these days what is credible and what isn't? And
mhm,
at Trusting News, we just have a lot of empathy for that situation. We have a lot of empathy for how confusing it is to tell what's true. Frankly, with AI, how confusing it is to even tell what's real. And we're doing a lot more work with creator journalists, with independent journalists. Like, people, for the first time this year in a global news study, more people turned to social media than TV for
mhm.
news. And so the the best way to respond to that, I think, is not defensiveness about traditional journalism. It's saying, anywhere people are turning for information, we want them to be able to tell whether it's worthy of their trust. What are the credibility signals in a social media video, in a newsletter, in a podcast, in an online story? What are the signals of credibility that say, this is trustworthy and here's how you know that? So whether you are an independent person or working in a traditional newsroom, we would like you to better equip your audience, your community, the public, to navigate information.
So I think that makes a lot of sense when you're on social media. I mean, it's not just like, here's the authoritative person telling you about this, and this. What are those credibility markers that you recommend people look out for?
Yeah. Well, sometimes um, what I take for granted as somebody who grew up in newsrooms that would be credible, like, we have a staff of journalists behind us. Actually, for some people, they value the authenticity and independence of
Mhm.
creator model journalists more than they value the sort of tradition and institution of a legacy newsroom.
Oh,
So
that's
I think that.
interesting. Because
Mhm.
actually, when I think of journalism kind of writ large, independent, like single creators, it's a passion project, or if you're doing investigative things, you can
Mhm.
go really deep in your passion, but then you can't cover a million other things. And
Right.
that's like the institutional newsroom allows you to cover the day to day and go deep. So that's so interesting that
Mhm.
people are now valuing sort of that authenticity of experience. And I wonder if
And
there's
the
a way to,
independent spirit of it. Like,
yeah.
like plenty of independent journalists now are saying, like, I'm going to tell you what I really think. There's nobody telling me what I can and can't say.
Mm,
And the lines get blurred about whether
right.
how much of that is sort of analysis or opinion, how much of it is straight information. But regardless, I think being honest about where you're coming from, being clear about where your money is coming from, like,
Mhm.
how are you funded? And is there anything you do or don't say based on who gives you money? Your ethical framework, your focus. Here's how I'm deciding what to cover or what to bring you. I respect your time, and I want you to know consistently that here's what you're going to get from me. Um, Corrections, like I'll tell you if I mess up. So a lot of the basic principles that go into trustworthy information apply regardless of platform.
Mhm.
Um, but so a lot of what we do at Trusting News can work regardless of whether you are working on a big team in a traditional newsroom, whether you are on, kind of working for an independent investigative podcast, or whether you're just a person with your own newsletter doing your best to keep your neighbors
Mhm.
informed.
Well, and the idea that people are loving that independent spirit, that authenticity, that sort of small. It's sort of like the all the creators of like, hey, I'm doing my beautiful plant stand or home decorating, and you don't see the army behind them. There might also be lessons for institutional newsrooms to really talk about how editorial and advertising is separate, how local newsrooms separate themselves from, their chain hierarchy and things like that. So
Mhm.
are there other sort of, aside from sort of that independent spirit thing, are there, and the transparency and looking at sort of the story behind the story, are there other kind of markers that people kind of innately trust once they see it, that newsrooms should be looking out for?
I think that there is, I started off our conversation talking about elements of emotional trust, like benevolence.
Mm-hmm.
There's an affinity that happens when you hear from an individual. You feel a connection to someone, and local TV has known this forever, that people
Sure.
have their favorite anchor or something. But there is something that happens when there's a consistency to a personality and a delivery and a voice, that
Mm,
over time you think, well, this person's telling me the truth. And there's an efficiency to that a lot of social media creators feel like sort of your trusted friend.
sure.
Like the way that we do interpersonally, when people show up at my house for a book club and they say, Joy, I don't even know what the news these days. It's just so much. Can you tell me what's really happening? Because I've tuned out. I can't. Can you just explain to me what's happening? And they trust me because we have a history and a shorthand built up and whatever. And so I think a lot of people are feeling that way about their favorite Instagram account where they talk about the news, is somebody saying, if I tune into this person, I'll know what I need to know. It gives me the sort of the freedom and permission to otherwise tune out. I trust over time that what they're telling me is true. I can pass it on to other people. And then I'm kind of serving a purpose of like informing my network. I think that personal connection is something that can be sort of a shorthand for trust.
And like, that is the crux of what local journalism does. They are, sort of the curator of news. Like, if you read, and I always feel like print newspapers are the self-care of the world, because if you find the print newspaper that works for you, you can read that and say, I don't need to think about all the alerts that are coming in. I can actually, like, I personally just turn off all of the alerts, because I don't need to be jerked out of my day to worry or think about something I can't do anything about.
Mhm.
So I would love to have, here's the capsule content. I know
Yep,
what's
and you get to the
important,
end of it, and then it
and
gives
I'm
you
done.
permission to step away. Yeah, and I think a lot of people feel that way about a creator who shows up in their Instagram feed, because it's like, if
Mhm.
I'm here and I'm scrolling, if there's something I need to know, it'll pop up, it'll find me. I don't have to go find it.
Right.
And then I step away, and I know that if something else comes up that's urgent, that person will show up in my feed again.
hmm So I think those are interesting lessons that news media sort of writ large can take advantage of, because I do feel like, in news media's sort of quest to be objective and impartial, they've also become impersonal.
Mhm.
And that's not the collection of newsroom personalities that are there. Very vibrant. Like, those are individual people, just like in any organization. but there's not been a really strong brand voice, I think, for a lot of news media, because I think sometimes they don't think they need it, or they don't understand, that you need more than the news to attract people.
Mhm. Mhm. And also, they struggle with staffing and have
Hmm.
a lot of turnover. And, some people are looking at local news and saying, why is it a different face on TV every time I turn it on? Or why
Hmm.
am I not recognizing these bylines? Or why are there just fewer bylines than they used to be? And
Right.
that is something we don't talk enough about as well.
Hmm. So then how would you, what's next for Trusting News? Are you, you have your academic partners, so you're doing research, you're seeing sort of trust evolve in the marketplace in some ways. You have those great
Mhm.
trust kits. How can people and organizations engage with you? And sort of what's next, as you didn't realize that we were talking on, oh, so the 10th anniversary in some ways, but what's ahead for the next 10 years seems a lot to think through, but what's ahead for you?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, our goal is for the information landscape, all the actors in the information landscape, to do a better job of earning trust, of recognizing that they need to equip people to understand what's trustworthy. Some ways to keep in touch with us are, the best way to keep in touch with us is our weekly newsletter, Trust Tips,
Mhm,
trustingnews.org/newsletter. And we send one quick strategy. And that's also where we announce upcoming trainings. We do a lot of free programming, webinars and trainings for newsrooms. We also work one-on-one with news companies or organizations, setting up training for them. A few things that we are You're right that the information landscape is changing so fast. And so a lot of times our focus areas are on helping journalists meet the moment as it evolves. So a
mm,
few ways the moment is evolving right now that we're focusing on. One is on creator model journalists, and we're coaching creators in signaling their credibility and learning as much as we can about how people are deciding which creators to trust, which I think has lessons for the whole landscape.
mhm,
We're doing a lot of work around artificial intelligence and what the public thinks about how journalists use AI. Man, the public is skeptical about it.
oh,
And
sure,
we need to be disclosing it in ways that actually build trust and helping the public understand what it helps us achieve. We also are working on, so we've got a lot of research around disclosures of AI use for different, if you're using it to translate, if you're using it to summarize, if you're using it to transcribe interviews, like how are the ways, if you're using it in editing, it needs to be disclosed, and here's how to do that. We're
mhm,
also working on sort of AI education, how journalists can be a source of education and empowerment and literacy for communities about what AI is and how it works, how it's being used in their community, what it's good at, what it's not good at. People are
mhm,
confused fundamentally. And so journalists can be a real source of, we can really equip people to feel more comfortable navigating the
mhm,
landscape. And then a third area we're focused on a lot is political division. This is the crisis of division in our country, and
sure,
how journalists can fuel curiosity rather than polarization. The
mhm,
numbers, if you look at the polling around the survey work around who trusts journalists, there's a real partisan divide,
mhm,
and journalists are serving people who lean left well, and we are fundamentally have a huge gap in trust with people who lean right and also with moderates.
mhm,
And so we have a line of programming and training around reaching beyond our political bubbles and
mhm.
understanding how to better reflect the nuance and complexity of people across the spectrum, and how journalism can make people more curious about each other and build empathy and help people navigate democracy together and make shared decisions.
That sounds like a really interesting, span, heading up to the midterms. Are there any sort of early tips? I know you probably haven't finished that training series yet, but what are you kind of finding when you say using journalism to foster curiosity? Is it sort of trust in a different vein, or trust being
Mhm.
utilized in a different way? What does that
Um,
building bridges over divides look like?
We start with, we have a resource that we call the anti-polarization checklist that invites journalists to assess the questions they're asking, their sourcing, the language they're using, how they frame stories to make sure they are not accidentally um, rooting, creating content that is hearable by and relevant to one end of the political spectrum over the other. We do a lot of work around journalists' internal perspectives on staff. How many people covering abortion across the country have a deep understanding of and empathy for people who are anti-abortion?
Mhm.
How many, in newsrooms, we come from urban, educated, more liberal perspectives typically. So where does that leave us as we're covering some of the big divisive social issues of our time? And there's a lot that we need to understand better about. Let's look at immigration coverage and look across the stakeholders. Um, who, which what lens on immigration do we feel like is well covered in our
Mhm.
stories? And which people might be looking at this saying, yeah, but they're not asking the questions that matter to me, or I don't feel like they understand the way that I see this or the challenges I'm facing here.
Mhm.
So I think nobody likes to be oversimplified.
Sure.
Nobody likes to be stereotyped. And I think that journalists cover well people and issues that they understand well and have deep experience with. We are not as good at nuanced coverage of people and issues that we have a more simplistic understanding of. And so I think it comes back to a lot of the listening and humility of, are we saying, oh, we know how somebody voted, and so therefore we must know all these things about them? Or are we willing to say, to try to get to know the complexity and nuance and how people see the world?
I feel like that is a wonderful way I feel like we're going to be talking again because I'd love to hear more about how you're bridging divides. And those are some great first steps and tips. But it sounds like, building trust is really central and kind of shorthand for all the other things that are going on in the industry, like how to be more relevant, how to bring in diverse voices. You can't do all those things unless you have a basis of trust in order to sort of open up those lines of communication and to feel like you have ways that you are allowing your organizations and the journalists that you work with to hear the things that might be uncomfortable to them. So I'm excited to see what you do in the next 10 years. I really appreciate you coming to talk to me about the trust kits. And there's a lot to offer there. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.